Overthinking is one of those things that feels deceptively useful. On the surface, it feels like you're being productive. You're analyzing, you're evaluating, you're preparing. You're replaying conversations in your head to see what you could have said differently. You're running future scenarios to figure out what might go wrong. You're considering every possible angle before you take a step. And there's a part of your brain that convinces you this is progress. That the more time you spend thinking about something, the closer you are to actually solving it. But what's fascinating is that most overthinkers, despite all of this mental effort, actually don't move forward. They get stuck in the same place, cycling endlessly through the same thoughts. The needle doesn't move, opportunities pass them by. Days, weeks, sometimes even years disappear, and all they have to show for it is exhaustion. So why does this happen? Why does something that feels like careful preparation actually become the very thing that blocks us from progress? The answer lies in the way the mind mistakes rumination for problem solving. When you have a problem, your brain automatically engages in thought. But there are two different kinds of thought. One is constructive thinking, identifying the issue, exploring solutions, and taking concrete steps. The other is rumination, going in circles around the problem, replaying it, obsessing about what could have been or what might happen without ever moving into action. The tricky part is that both of these processes feel the same at the start. The mind doesn't raise a flag that says, "Hey, you're ruminating now. This is useless." It just feels like thinking. And by the time you realize you're stuck in a loop, hours have passed and nothing has changed. For overthinkers, this becomes a chronic pattern. Something as simple as sending an email can trigger days of rumination. You start drafting the email, then you second-guess your wording. Then you worry about how the other person will perceive it. Then you start imagining negative outcomes, then you feel anxious about being anxious. What could have been a 2-minute task now balloons into an emotional ordeal. Multiply that by the number of decisions and interactions in daily life, and you begin to see why overthinkers are so exhausted and so stuck. The cost IS&T just wasted time is the paralysis that comes from never actually completing things. Now, from a psychological perspective, rumination serves a function. It's not random. The brain doesn't do things without reason. Rumination is often the mind's attempt to gain control over uncertainty. When something feels unpredictable or threatening, the brain starts replaying and analyzing it to try to find certainty. For example, if you had an awkward conversation with a friend, you might replay it 50 times in your head, looking for hidden meanings in their tone or body language. The brain thinks that if it can just analyze enough, it will figure out the truth and you'll feel safe again. But the reality is that most of the situations we ruminate about don't have a clear answer. You can never know exactly what your friend was thinking. You can never predict every future outcome of a decision. So the search for certainty never ends. That's why overthinking feels endless. It's the mind trying to solve an unsolvable equation. What makes it worse is that overthinkers often hold a hidden belief, that their thoughts are preparation. They believe that by running through every possible scenario, they are equipping themselves to avoid mistakes, avoid pain, avoid regret. It feels like protection. But here's the paradox. The more they try to protect themselves by overthinking, the more harm they actually create. Because life keeps moving while they're stuck in their heads. Opportunities come and go, relationships weaken, tasks pile up, and instead of avoiding regret, they create new regrets, regret over wasted time, regret over missed chances, regret over never actually living. There's also a neurobiological layer to this. Rumination activates certain brain circuits that overlap with those involved in depression and anxiety. Specifically, the default mode network, which is active when the mind is wandering or reflecting inward, becomes overactive. Instead of switching between reflection and action, the overthinker's brain gets trapped in this inward loop. That's why overthinking often goes hand in hand with anxiety disorders and depression. The more you ruminate, the worse you feel. The worse you feel, the more you ruminate. It becomes a self-perpetuating cycle. And if we dig deeper, rumination is often tied to past experiences. Many overthinkers grew up in environments where mistakes had high costs. Maybe they had critical parents who pounced on every error. Maybe they faced bullying, where one wrong word could lead to ridicule. Maybe they experienced instability, where every decision felt like it carried huge consequences. In those environments, overthinking was adaptive. It made sense to carefully analyze every action because the risks were real. Overthinking became a survival strategy. But the problem is that once you leave those environments, the brain doesn't update its strategy. It keeps overthinking even when the stakes aren't life or death. And what was once adaptive becomes maladaptive. So what we have is a brain that is trying to keep you safe by controlling uncertainty, trying to prepare you for every outcome, trying to prevent mistakes. But in reality, it's trapping you in cycles of rumination that stop you from moving forward. The safety is an illusion. And here's the painful truth. Progress requires uncertainty. Every meaningful step in life, starting a new project, entering a relationship, changing careers, involves risk. There's no way to think yourself into certainty. You can only act. Overthinkers struggle precisely because they are unwilling to tolerate the discomfort of uncertainty. They try to think their way out of it instead of stepping into it. And that's why they make no progress. Because progress requires movement, and rumination keeps them still. They might feel like they're working, but they're actually just pacing in a mental cage. And the longer they stay in that cage, the harder it becomes to leave. Their confidence erodes, their self-trust declines, and their fear of mistakes grows. Eventually, they may stop trying altogether, resigning themselves to a life of thinking about things without ever doing them. This is why breaking the cycle of rumination is not about thinking less, but about learning to relate differently to your thoughts. It's about recognizing when you're in a loop, realizing that the loop will never give you certainty, and choosing action anyway. It's about retraining the nervous system to tolerate uncertainty instead of trying to eliminate it. It's about healing the wounds that made you believe mistakes are catastrophic. And it's about learning to value imperfect progress over perfect paralysis. Overthinkers often confuse clarity with control. They believe that if they can just think long enough, if they can dissect every angle and replay every possibility, then they'll finally feel clear enough to act. But the truth is, clarity doesn't come from thinking, it comes from doing. It comes from stepping into the unknown, making a choice, and then learning from what unfolds. But for someone who ruminates, the unknown feels intolerable. And because they can't tolerate the unknown, they keep trying to solve it in their heads. They keep waiting for that perfect moment when they'll feel fully ready. That moment never comes. Imagine someone standing at the edge of a swimming pool. They're afraid of the water. They keep analyzing. What if it's too cold? What if I can't swim? What if people laugh at me? What if I panic? They can spend hours, even days, standing there, replaying all those possibilities in their head. But the only way to actually learn how the water feels is to jump in. The moment they do, their body learns more in 2 seconds than their brain learned in 2 hours. Overthinkers are like that person standing at the edge of the pool forever, waiting to feel safe enough to jump. And the tragedy is that they never discover that their body could have handled it all along. Now, part of why this happens is because many overthinkers confuse intellectual preparation with emotional readiness. They think, if I understand enough, I'll feel confident enough to act. But emotional readiness doesn't come from understanding. It comes from exposure. It comes from practice. No one becomes confident about driving by reading the manual. You only feel confident after you actually get behind the wheel, stall the car a few times, and eventually learn through experience. But for overthinkers, the gap between understanding and action feels so overwhelming that they never get to that practice phase. They get stuck in the theory of living instead of the reality of it. And let's dig into that word stuck, because it's one that overthinkers use a lot. They'll say, I feel stuck in life, or I'm not making progress. What they really describing is the paralysis that comes from too much self-reflection without enough external movement. Being stuck is not a lack of options. It's an excess of internal loops that never resolve. And ironically, the more stuck they feel, the more they ruminate about being stuck, which makes them feel even more stuck. It's like quicksand. The harder you struggle in your thoughts, the deeper you sink. Another layer is perfectionism. Overthinkers often carry this subtle belief that there is a perfect choice, a perfect path, a perfect action. And if they can just think long enough, they'll discover it. But perfectionism is the twin of rumination. Both are rooted in fear of mistakes. Both are attempts to avoid regret. Both paralyze instead of liberate. And here's the reality: there is no perfect choice. There are only choices, each with their own set of outcomes, lessons, and trade-offs. The obsession with perfection is really an obsession with control. And the more an overthinker chases it, the more life slips by while they're busy trying to engineer the impossible. This leads us to the role of time. Overthinkers have a distorted relationship with time. They spend enormous amounts of time in their heads, but very little time in the world. They treat time as though it's infinite, thinking they can always act later once they're sure. But ironically, they also feel like they're running out of time, which fuels the pressure to get it right. So they live in this double bind, afraid of wasting time by making the wrong choice, but wasting years by making no choice at all. It's tragic, because by the time they realize how much time has slipped away, the regret is far heavier than any mistake would have been. If we go deeper, we find that rumination is often tied to shame. Overthinkers carry a sense of inadequacy, a fear that they're not good enough, not smart enough, not capable enough. So every decision feels like proof. If they succeed, they might silence the shame temporarily. But if they fail, the shame is confirmed. To avoid that possibility, they stay in their heads. They rehearse, they delay, they analyze endlessly, because as long as the decision is not made, they can't fail. Rumination becomes a way of protecting their fragile self-worth. But the price of that protection is that they never get the evidence that they actually are capable. They never give themselves the chance to succeed because they're too afraid of confirming their fear of failure. And this creates a self-fulfilling prophecy. By avoiding action to avoid failure, they actually fail by default. By overthinking in an attempt to protect their worth, they end up eroding it because deep down, they know they're not living up to their potential. Over time, their self-trust collapses. They stop believing in their ability to follow through. And once you stop trusting yourself, every decision feels even heavier because you don't believe you'll handle what comes next. At its core, rumination is about safety. The brain is saying, if I just think more, I'll be safe. But life is not safe. Life is uncertain. Life involves risks, mistakes, and failures. And ironically, the people who grow the most are the ones who are willing to be unsafe for a while, to make mistakes, to stumble forward. Overthinkers struggle precisely because they want the growth without the risk, the clarity without the uncertainty, the progress without the pain. And that equation simply doesn't exist. Now let's look at relationships, because rumination wreaks havoc there too. Overthinkers replay conversations, wondering what someone meant by a single word, or why they didn't text back right away. They analyze the tiniest signals, often reading rejection or criticism where there is none. This leads to insecurity, jealousy, or withdrawal. Their partner might feel confused because what seemed like a small, normal moment to them has become a huge internal storm for the overthinker. And instead of bringing issues to the surface, overthinkers often keep them in their head, trying to figure it out privately. But relationships don't grow in silence. They grow in communication. So rumination creates emotional distance. The overthinker feels unsafe and misunderstood, and the partner feels shut out or accused of things they never actually did. Over time, this dynamic can sabotage even healthy relationships. And in careers, overthinkers often stall. They hesitate to apply for jobs because their resume isn't perfect yet. They delay starting projects because they're not sure if it's the right idea. They hold back from speaking up in meetings because they're not sure their contribution is valuable. Meanwhile, people who are less talented but more decisive move ahead, simply because they act. Overthinkers often look back years later and realize that their biggest regret is not the mistakes they made, but the opportunities they never took. And that's the cruel irony. Rumination is supposed to prevent regret, but it creates the deepest regrets of all. On a biological level, rumination keeps the nervous system in a low-grade state of stress. The mind is constantly scanning, analyzing, preparing. Cortisol stays elevated. Sleep quality suffers. The body never gets true rest because the brain is always in what-if mode. Over years, this can lead to physical consequences: fatigue, headaches, digestive issues, even cardiovascular problems. The cost of rumination isn't just emotional, it's physical. The body pays for the mind's inability to let go. So what's the way out? It starts with awareness. The first step is recognizing when you're ruminating. That's harder than it sounds because rumination disguises itself as useful thought. But if you find yourself replaying the same scenario over and over without new insight, you're ruminating. If you notice that hours have passed and you haven't taken any action, you're ruminating. If you feel more anxious after thinking instead of less, you're ruminating. Once you catch it, the key is not to fight the thoughts. That only makes them louder. The key is to redirect from analysis to action. Ask yourself, what is the smallest step I can take right now? Not the perfect step, not the final step, the smallest one. Because action breaks the cycle in a way thought never can. And the deeper healing comes from working on the underlying wounds. You have to challenge the belief that mistakes define you. You have to learn that failure is survivable, even useful. You have to build tolerance for uncertainty, training your nervous system to handle the discomfort instead of trying to eliminate it. This doesn't happen overnight. It happens gradually through small acts of courage, through learning to act before you're ready, through discovering that you can stumble and still move forward. Overthinkers don't need to think less, they need to feel safer. Because once the nervous system feels safe, the need to overthink fades. Safety doesn't come from certainty. It comes from trust that you can handle whatever comes. Trust that mistakes won't destroy you. Trust that progress is built on action, not perfection.